Welcome back to the Morning Show here on Arise News. I am Adesua Omoruan.
I'm Rufai Yosini.
And I'm Sheto Atigari. Good morning.
Following the United Nations General Assembly adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development as the agreed framework for international development, the agenda presents a much wider scope by deliberately and more encompassing by incorporating economic and environmental sustainability, as well as the aspiration of many countries for peaceful and inclusive societies.
Nigeria, with the largest economy in Africa, is described as a super important country for achieving this SDG globally. And that is why the women's equality and empowerment plays a critical role in all the sustainable development goals.
Flying the SDG flag in Nigeria is Dr. Ndidi Nnoli, previously engaged at the Lagos Business School and Pan Atlantic University, with responsibility for public-private partnerships as well as teaching ethics, sustainability, and social entrepreneurship. She has served as a nominee director for the World Bank IFC since 2012 and served on a few non-profit boards, including co-chairing the Private Sector Advisory Group on SDGs, initiated by the President in February 2017. She is the Group Chief Sustainability and Governance Officer of the Dangote Group. All right, it's a joy talking to you, and it's a joy meeting you once again after a very long time. I mean, let's just put a finger on the problem, the challenge of female entrepreneurs all over Africa and all over the world. They create more economic vitality, but they are not adequately represented on the economic map. What a contrast.
Good contrast. Essentially what we're talking about is we're talking about really not adequately deploying 50% of our manpower. And yet, what is fascinating about especially the African continent and Nigeria is that in the informal sector, it is driven by women. I mean, I'm reading a book at the moment, The Power of Lift. And it talks about, which you see very often when you're driving through rural communities, you will find a gentleman on a bicycle, and you will find a woman with a child on her back and a child in her hand, and carrying weight. That really is the symbol of the African woman. But beyond micro, where we've now firmly established that, you know, women are creditworthy and women repayment rates of loans are much higher. And women are industrious and major contributors to the economy. In the middle tier, when you talk about small and medium-scale enterprises or enterprises in the supply chain, what we find is that there are many women-owned businesses that don't gain access to capital and therefore are unable to grow, partly because our systems, our processes, and our criteria are not adequately catering for all genders and all ages, whether young or old, male or female, but also because sometimes women also need the encouragement to step up and to be more ambitious. We need to break through the cultural barriers of, I think we were under the bridge on Women's Day in March this year, and what I liked most about one of those speeches was that we must bring our daughters up, not just to be good mothers or good wives, but also to be good board directors, good CEOs. We must seed that in their minds very early on so that they have the potential and the drive and the interest to be everything that they could be. And
I mean, I have a follow-up to that real quickly. And I'd segue into that great book by Melinda Gates, you know, Lift, powerful book, read that book. And what she pretty much was talking about in that book is the fact that we are not creating that viable ecosystem enough, despite the fact that they carry the community, despite the fact that they lift, as Melinda Gates used in that book very powerfully, every time. Some will argue that a lot has been done as regards female entrepreneurs. Take, for instance, the recent grant by the G7 of over 200, billion for the African Development Bank for female entrepreneurs. But it's still like a drop in the ocean. We don't see it.
So I mean, I was reading yesterday that the estimated gap for women-owned businesses is about $42 billion in Africa. according to the African Development Bank. And that what has been allocated, for example, to Nigeria as one of Africa's largest economies, I think was approximately $61.8 million. So when you look at the difference between the amount that is estimated as a gap and the amount that is allocated, that's one gap. Then the second is, of the funding that is actually available, how much of it is drawn down? And what are the systems and processes and procedures that are necessary for a drawdown? And our businesses, whether these are women-owned businesses or young people's businesses or small and medium-scale enterprises generically, are they prepped? Do we have the right governance in place? Do we have the right legal structures? Do we have the right financial statements? Do we even understand how much money we require at this particular point in time? Do we have a system? We spent some time yesterday on affirmative procurement, and we talked about how important it is for large organizations to actually help to create more amenable access to capital for their supply chain and their value chain. So a lot of the time, a smaller company supplies a big company, but they have to wait for 60 days, 90 days to get paid. And that essentially can cripple a small business on the one hand. And on the other hand, small businesses also need to be smarter about being able to access capital in order to meet those terms of the 60 to 90-day wait, which is really the standard in very many places. So big point is, one, I think rather than focus only on women and only from a gender perspective, what we've got to see is women have significant value to add and they carry a lot. They also, what we very often forget is that women, but also men these days, are actually very hands-on with the next generation. And the next generation is the future. When you talk about sustainability, you've got to think 10 years ahead. You've got to think 100 years ahead. And so the question is, how do we enable economic growth, especially in an era where in Nigeria we know that our greatest national security threat is the teeming youth that are unemployed and that actually have no hope. And what is the responsibility of us all, women and men, in terms of ensuring that we are creating an ecosystem that encourages more than the norm? So not just the big businesses to thrive, but actually everybody along the supply chain and the value chain. And a lot of those businesses are owned by women and by young people.
And so in looking at all of this and the projections, especially as it concerns the Sustainable Development Goals, it's just about 11 years away. Are we having enough discussion around this subject? I mean, interestingly, Rufai has pointed out, and you've also affirmed that, despite having most female entrepreneurs in the world, African female entrepreneurs still find it difficult to access finance from traditional means for different reasons. So are we having the right conversations around this, especially as it concerns the SDGs, as I said, and particularly Goal 5, gender equality?
So there's the fact that the SDGs have a specific goal that is focused on, it's called gender equality. Mm-hmm. I like to refer to it as gender equity, mm-hmm, because it's really about finding balance. And the fact that there are now actually significant sums of capital targeted towards gender lens investing, or not just men, specifically trying to target women, means that there is actually a lot more awareness and there is a shift in consciousness. The fact that the Sustainable Development Goals also finally acknowledge the importance of business. So to promote sustainable development and sustainable growth or sustainable economic growth, you can't look at it as grant and philanthropy. It's got to be seen as business. So it's great to see women coming to the table, not because you feel you need to add women and youth, but just because they say, I'm a woman, I'm a good businesswoman, I'm a good credit risk. Look at the trend. We actually, because we are very wary of risk, are better bets for your money. We are more likely to repay. We are more likely to not just grow a business, but also think about how that business impacts on the environment, how it impacts on society. Where the huge gap is at the moment is that it's only what you measure that is valued. And so while we talk about the SDGs in general terms, or we talk about gender equity or gender equality in general terms, what is really important is that we measure progress. Where are we making progress? Okay, yes, you've made available $60 million or $200 million. How much of that has been drawn down? What has been the impact of the money that you drew down? Did you give the $100 million to one company, and that one company did one transaction? Did you give it to 10 companies, and those 10 companies employed 2,000 people? Did you give it to 10 funds, and those funds created 10,000 jobs? What is the impact of what we're doing with our money? That is the big question. And how do we ensure that as we measure our impact on the SDGs, that we're measuring the same, using the same terminology or using the same measures so that we can compare? And most importantly, on SDG number 17, how do we ensure that we're collaborating, so we're minimizing the wastage in between, so that there's more one group building on another in collaboration with others? And in some cases, that means competitors also collaborating to achieve common goals that serve all of us.
Now, looking at the pillars of sustainable development, we are still seeing that it's not sympathetic to the plight of an everyday woman. Women are still low on education and on physical security. Now, to bring it back to even the recent Port Harcourt killings, I don't know if you've heard about it, that, we have like a serial killer on the loose. And the first response from the Nigerian police force was, oh, they're prostitutes. So we're still seeing on a very local scale that women are still seen as commodities and are still seen as being people that can't fend for themselves. What's being done to change the mindset of even the men who we're supposed to be equal with when we're talking about gender equality?
You know what I loved the most about, I was reading one of the chapters of the book you referred to, the Gates book, yesterday. And what I loved the most about the way that she writes is that you can really hear a woman who is listening from a completely different world and mindset. And it helps us to realize, and I can't go into the specific story in my mind right now, it helps us to realize how much of empowerment is actually being able to understand the cultural antecedents and precedents in a particular area. And how much of that empowerment has really got to be self-empowerment. It's really got to be voices. One of the things I think that women could do more of is actually football. It's my favorite example. And they beat each other.
We'll go for a quick break and we'll come back and talk about the collaborations even more. It's time for a quick break. Okay. We'll be right back. Keep it locked right here on the Arise News Channel.
Great to have you back here on the Morning Show on the Arise News Channel. And we're still talking about women empowerment and the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you so much for staying with us. You were about to land on that thought of how women are perceived. Shaitan was asking you, bringing it, localizing it, especially citing the Rivers incident, the ongoing Port Harcourt incident where some 8 women have been reportedly killed. You wanted to land on that thought?
I was saying that, a lot of the stigma that women are associated with, I think women also have a responsibility to help to lift some of that stigma. And I talked about collaboration. I was trying to lighten what is actually a very, very heavy burden. I think the number of deaths that we have at the moment due to violence and due to, I don't want to refer to the xenophobia or, other stigmas. It's just so sad. And I think that, the bottom line is that, and we very often forget that, once this country degenerates into civil unrest, everybody loses. Everybody does. And so it really is critical to be able to enable the forces that there are. I was making light of it by talking about football and the fact that, guys get onto the football match and football pitch and they go to war and they're beating each other. But as soon as they get off, they're having a beer, right? Or likewise, women can compete and collaborate. And because you guys, you do that. So there are many things that men can learn from women. There are many things that women can learn from men. And so the reason why I like gender equity as opposed to gender equality is it's not a competition. It's really more of an alignment. And, speaking about the Sustainable Development Goals, it's really a set of goals that are intended to help us create a space where everyone can have access. The line, leaving no one behind, is so absolutely critical. And when you talk about stigma and what very, very many women are obliged to do, it's really to put food on the table. Very often it's to get a kid into school or to sustain someone. And you're trying to say something, yes. I can tell.
I'm just eager to put this out there because we should point out that no country has achieved gender equity or equality. However, there are those who are a bit more friendly, gender friendly. And when you look at some of the statistics available on the continent when it comes to gender parity in politics, education, agriculture, information technology training, even wage payment, you find that Nigeria seems to be lagging. And I just wonder, who has failed the Nigerian woman, in your own opinion?
Who has failed the Nigerian woman? So I'm half Nigerian, but I very often say that I am 100% Nigerian. So people look at my color and then they question me. But my mother is even lighter than myself, and she wears only Nigerian clothes. And I have found, and I think I am able to say that the strongest women I have seen or that I know are Nigerian women. They are inspiring, they are strong, they are entrepreneurial, they are driven, they are able to overcome everything. And sometimes, the quote of that same book is Marianne Williamson's quote, which says, sometimes the greatest hurdle that we have is to actually recognize the greatness that we have within. And beyond saying, our creator and our God, it's very critical that women look at themselves and step up and step out and step forward and be. So I don't want to say that it's very, very unorthodox to say that perhaps the biggest problem is that women need to look in the mirror themselves and realize that nobody can hold them back other than themselves, first and foremost. Secondly, a lot of the cultural practices, whether you talk about widowhood rights or female genital mutilation, you'll actually find that a lot of those practices are actually perpetuated by women themselves. So, or the stigmatization of, you talked about prostitutes, it's much more women than men. So we first of all have to get ourselves out of these boxes. And the second thing is, as business women, I do a lot of angel investing in my spare time, and I did a lot more before I took on my present role as sustainability lead. A man half as competent and knowledgeable and experienced will come to the table and ask for $5 million. A woman twice as competent, knowledgeable, and experienced will maybe ask for $10,000 or $100,000. So why is it that we're not more ambitious, right? Why is it that we don't dare more? I'm not saying that's generic. I'm just saying the majority that I've come across. Women don't necessarily own their financial numbers. They will say, you do the finance, I will do the passionate, the creative part. You must own your numbers. You must understand where you're making your money, where you're losing money, how you can drop the costs. Because if you don't get that right, you can't grow your business.
All right, I want to jump in here. Historically, we have an historical antecedent that says Nigerian women come together. I mean, about women's war. Wasn't a riot. No, it wasn't a riot like the British made it to be, because they killed over 40 or 50 women. Wanyewura and the likes, and other prominent women like that. The likes of Buchi Emecheta, Florent Wankwa and the likes. But what you see today is very damning. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine, an entrepreneur woman. She wanted to start a school, got a place, some women kicked against her. And she was narrating this to me yesterday, and she said, you know, Rufai, after investing 60 million naira of my money, the shocking thing is that a woman kicked against me and they didn't make me start that school. And after a major women group in Nigeria sent her a message to attend some function, she said she copied the mail and she forwarded it back to them. And she said, what are women doing to other women? Mm-hmm. There are tons of female entrepreneurs asking that same question. Other women are blocking the door for them, are going through those doors and are shutting it for them.
You know, so I'm a sustainability expert. My PhD is sustainability. And what we always say about sustainability is a journey. Women with one another, it's a journey of evolution. And it starts weirdly with little things, right? Your little girl has to stay pretty. She can't go out and get herself all muddied. Boy, who
play in the mud.
Correct. Football, I keep going back to football because the way you learn how to work with one another, football is such a powerful tool. I'm not talking about professional football, as kids. You learn to respect the guy who is a great striker, but a really bad goalkeeper, right? You value what is good about them. You don't expect them to be perfect. Somehow, as women, we're acculturated to you have got to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect career woman. You've got to somehow balance everything. And above all, we expect ourselves to be perfect. Once you don't love yourself, how can you love anyone else? So it's really, part of it is really, that's why I said that you asked me the question, who has failed the African woman? And my response is we've got to first look ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves, how do we love ourselves more, allow ourselves more, and allow ourselves to dream more, be more ambitious, fail more if necessary, and then encourage each other more, collaborate with each other more. I think men do that so well. And we need to pick some of that up, just like you need to pick some of that up in terms of nurturing, in terms of impact, in terms of caring. And I don't think it's true that women don't support one another, because I know quite a few circles where that has really changed. But it's a process and it's a journey, but it's a very, very critical one.
It is a universal phenomenon to see a lot of women in the home place, you know, doing domestic work. They're the ones that, like you said, take care of the children. They're basically the homemakers. But this happens without wage. And you find out that most of the time that a woman could go out into the community and give back, you know, economically, she's spending that time at home, taking care of the children without pay. I know this is outside the box, but is it possible that this can be seen as something that maybe could be, you know, brought back into society where it's not just first off the woman who does this, but maybe there's an incentive that goes into, you know, this work that is done by women that men would usually just see as, oh, you're supposed to do this. Wifely duties. Do you think that could be an incentive? I know it's out of the box, but what do you think?
I had a conversation at, I think it was Women in Marketing, WIMCA. I spoke at the WIMCA conference, and a lady came to me afterwards and she sat with me and she said she cried when I spoke. I can't remember what I said. And she said, you know, I have always given my husband a very hard time for going out and making money. Meanwhile, I know that I make more money than him. And so I've wondered to myself, she said, for the first time when I heard you, I thought I should give him leeway to take care of the kids and to be a homemaker because he wants to, okay? And I can then go out and do, and so you see, very often we don't realize that there are actually quite a few men who are very hands-on parents and who actually sometimes are better at parenting than the women are. And if you look at it equitably and you take away that breadwinner status from the men, which is as much a burden on them sometimes as the wife status is on women, then what happens is you create, that's what I mean by equity. Not equality, equity. allow each person to reach their full potential. That's one. And secondly, I honestly believe that there are companies, and I won't mention any, in Nigeria that are beginning to put in flexible hours, that are beginning to recognize, especially with the millennials, that actually you can not have to do a 9-to-5 job and be so much more productive. Now imagine a situation whereby companies recognize that, actually, you can come to work at 10. It means that you reduce the traffic on the road. Some parents stay at home, take their kids to school. The quality of taking a child to school, being there, meeting with the teachers, seeing how they interact, and then coming to work.
I'll just quickly come in. We'll go for a quick break. We'll come back. We'll continue the conversation. Very interesting one.
Welcome back to the last lap of the morning show here on the Rise News. We still have Dr. Ndidi Nnoli in the studio with us. Thank you so much for staying with us. I want to bring to the attention, to this conversation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation scorecard on the Sustainable Development Goals 2019 report, which was released on Tuesday. Now, that report says that many low and middle income countries, including Nigeria, are struggling to achieve the SDGs, and says they might not even meet the target of 2030. And this is due to gender and geographical inequalities in most of these regions. And we've talked about the challenges that women face. And I just want to ask you, as a sustainable development expert, these challenges that women face, does it cut across the urban and the rural woman in Nigeria?
Absolutely, it does. And you know, the beautiful thing about challenges and problems is that there are also opportunities and solutions. Depends on where you see them from. So if I think about, I set up 20 years ago an entity called the Growing Businesses Foundation, and the objective was to spur sustainable development even before the SDGs. And we worked with a fast-moving consumer goods company that was trying to get into white spaces, so with made in Nigeria goods. And they found that they were being competed against by the Chinese products that were being flooded into the market, which didn't necessarily have as much quality. So we ran a campaign, which was a nutrition campaign, focused on getting more iron into the women's diets, focused on ensuring that women understood that they could get iron also from green leafy vegetables that were not overboiled. Bottom line is 2,500 women in white spaces where this FMCG large company had no sales were able to deliver close to 4 billion naira last year in terms of revenue. So they, who were previously unemployed and homemakers, if you like, suddenly had a job where they were not only health and nutrition ambassadors, but they were actively generating an income for themselves, increasing the status in their local communities, and also improving the revenue stream and the market share of a very large company. So that's a situation where through innovation, through collaboration, through outside of the box thinking, through below the line marketing as opposed to above the line marketing, so actually lower cost spend, you're able to achieve more and in tandem achieve various SDGs. Now, I talk about that, but nobody knows, because who's measuring the impact? And who is taking that model and asking yourself, okay, so this seems to have worked. How do I scale it? How do I make this not a CSR little pilot initiative with 2,500 women? We're a population of 200 million. Why isn't it 200,000 women? Correct. Why is the 3 billion or 4 billion not 40 or 400 billion? What is stopping us from doing that? So I think that's the big thing. First of all, our problem in Nigeria and across Africa is we don't collect data. And if we don't have data that we can collect and compare and plan with, we cannot invest, we cannot scale. And, I think that philanthropy is very important, but business is more important. And the SDGs are all about the United Nations finally coming to the table and understanding that, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, which were purely public sector or generally philanthropy or the great work that foundations do. What is more important is that businesses are making profits, but they're also being responsible about how they make their money. And they're being accountable about what kind of impact they're having, both negative and positive, and how they can spur sustainable economic development in tandem with their profitability.
I mean, this leads me to this question, and it's just an idea. Maybe we can adopt this model. In the 30s to the 40s in this country, in the East, something happened. A group of men started something called the Nnewi Youth League. And we know the Nnewi being the heartland of business in eastern Nigeria today was as a result of the starting of the Nnewi Youth League. There was a system where they brought in young men. Okay, you come do apprenticeship, come learn about this business, and they pulled them in. And you know, all the likes of the Betos of this world had direct link with the Nnewi Youth League. I hear a lot of women in the East having things like August meetings. Is it not time we start to have these meetings to be able to pull in an apprenticeship system, which we have on ground here, which is highly respected all over the world. In fact, we took an American professor to come in a TED Talk, tell us about our apprenticeship system that is said to be the most successful startup system in the world.
Yes. So 2006, I signed off my PhD in Frankfurt, and it was centered around exactly this thing that you talk about. So it's another example where I can probably point out to you and list 20 people who are experts on the apprenticeship system. But we didn't tell our own story. Somebody else had to tell it. That's why I keep saying we need to look in the mirror. And we need to see the value that we have. We need to look within. And you mentioned Nnewi and the Youth League. You mentioned the apprenticeship system. Very often we think that the biggest holdback to entrepreneurial growth is access to capital. But it's actually very often access to know-how, access to mentoring, access to the kind of encouragement, access to somebody at the top being willing to make way for people at the bottom to grow, and even to grow more than they grow. To have the humility to say, actually, you're 20 years younger than I am, but given the digital economy and given the knowledge economy and given where your vision is 100 times bigger than mine, I'm going to invest in you to ensure that you become double big. And that takes humility, but it's so critical. So I am 100% with you. If you decide to leave this set and go and start this initiative, I'll back it.
Great.
And just
Great.
before we run out of time, we cannot talk about all of this and not talk about Nigeria's status as to achieving these goals. The Bill and Melinda Gates report has said we cannot meet these goals, we're struggling. I wonder what your opinion is and what we need to start doing.
So first of all, I mean, I loved Melinda Gates' book, but it also breaks my heart that we're talking about Nigeria and I'm talking about Bill and Melinda Gates. I mean, I can think of 10 foundations, including Bill Gates, and I'll give you the example of what Dangote Rice is doing with the rice farmers. So generally, Dangote is known as a very big business that doesn't really do much at the bottom of the pyramid. We actually worked with the Aliko Dangote Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to create a model whereby the big business stays, but the entire model of rice milling is built around the ability to empower 200,000 farmers. What we're trying to do at the moment is make sure that there are many youth and women among that farming population. But it's really empowered by a bunch of agents in between. So small and medium scale enterprises who are much more effective at the bottom of the pyramid than a big enterprise can be. Now, what I'm hoping will happen is that we will have more models and more notions of foundations that are local, enterprises that are local, best practices that are local, initiatives that are local in Nigeria that we will cite and use as examples to tell the story globally. Private Sector Advisory Group on SDGs, which I co-chair, is one such conglomeration of different actors to try to make a change. We must look in the mirror. We must look at things like the Nnewi Youth League and examples of what have worked in the past to be applied in the present and take us into the future.
What have been the successes of that group what
private
and the
sector
challenges,
advisory
yes, because it was set up to bridge the gap and collaborate with government in achieving the sustainable development goals. What have been the successes so far?
So the private sector advisory group is, first of all, it was set up as the private sector coming together in order to implement things at the bottom of the pyramid and generally in the economy and to relate with government. It has actors with it like the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, Lagos Business School, yes, as well, Growing Businesses Foundation, etc. I think the biggest challenge right now is to be able to measure the impact of the various actors that are doing different things, and to first of all start from what is everyone doing, and how can you do what each person is doing better, collaboratively. How do we measure the impact so we know where we need to invest more, where we can do more? So the typical thing, and how do we integrate that into government policies to ensure that government is actually creating the right policies that enable the private sector and the right incentives, enable the private sector to invest properly? How do you build a better synergy and communication between public sector, private sector, civil society? How do you take cultural antecedents? I love the Nnewi Youth League, and make sure that those are built upon.
Well, I'd like to say a very big thank you to you for being here, Dr. Nnoli. That brings us to the end of the show today. I'm Rafai Yoseni.
I'm Adeso Almoran.
And I'm Sheto Atigari. Thank you for watching from our entire team here in Lagos. Enjoy the rest of your morning and, of course, the rest of your day. Goodbye.